Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is Dr. Joby. Today we're going to take a look at the relationship between the French positivist Auguste Comte and the Belgian statistician Adolphe Quetelet. We'll also begin our exploration into the three trends against positivism, that's rationalism, romanticism, and existentialism, that originate in the 18th century and last through the 19th and into the 20th and 21st centuries. This is episode 6, part 1 of the Dr. Joby podcast. L'homme moyen. This is the average man. When the French positivist Auguste Comte received word about a Belgian statistician's use of the term social physics, this was around 1835, he quickly distanced himself from the origination of the word. In fact, he began using a replacement term, one that would come to bring him recognition as the first sociologist. So Comte was really using this term social physics, and Quetelet began using it and publishing it. So he wanted to distance himself from this. But what was new about the sociology of Comte and the social physics of Adolphe Quetelet was the implementation of the science of statistics onto the human being. Statistics had come to be a standard, greatly influencing astronomy and physics. In Europe, Quetelet was the leading voice and was becoming a standard of the industrialized production of goods in the Industrial Revolution. The developer of the tea distribution, William Gossett, employed by the Guinness Brewing Company in Dublin, developed mathematical models for standardized production of stout. Quetelet and Comte both envisioned a scientific study of human beings that could be possible through the quantitative methodology of statistics. The field of scientific, quantifiable sociology had been born, what we called the social sciences. And it would not be long until the German psychophysicist Gustav Fechner and Wilhelm Wundt were applying statistics to the study of sensation and consciousness. The quantitative movement, having merged with Darwinian natural selection, became the rage in Britain and the United States. Psychometrician Francis Galton, social theorist Herbert Spencer, and statistician Carl Pearson, all supporters of human eugenics, promoted the quantitative methods in new social sciences of sociology and psychology, celebrating it as the elevation of these disciplines to an empirical sciences. Now today, the research fields of sociology and psychology are dominated by quantitative statistical methods. The American education system has greatly been influenced by educational psychology, a field which defines itself by the quantitative approach. The American schwarmerai with quantifiable statistical research has not diminished since the Industrial Revolution and Herbert Spencer's Darwinian capitalism. Quantifiable statistical research made workers more productive, factories more efficient, and capitalists more profit. Why wouldn't it be a way of making education more effective? So what we find here is a real shift during the first industrial revolution, the first mechanization of mass-produced goods, the statistical measures that were used in that industrialization applied to the human condition, which ushers in our next topic in the history of psychology, which includes quantitative IQ testing and categorization of humans through physical and psychological categorization. But before we get to that story, let's take a look at some other trends in thinking at this time, trends that will span from the 18th century through the 19th and into the 20th century. And in particular, these were trends that were opposed to positivism, and that is rationalism, existentialism, and romanticism. I think the first distinction that we'll want to make between the empiricists and the rationalists is the consideration of a passive versus an active mind. For the empiricists, the mind was passively associating ideas, sensations together in an automatic, in a mechanical way. But for the rationalists, this was an active activity. This was the mind minding in an active way. The mind almost took on its own character and interacted with the senses for the rationalists. For the rationalists, the mind contributed to the information of the senses. So it was much more than just an organizing organ. The rationalists believe in an innate, a priori structures of the mind that organize thought. It organizes thought, it shapes principles and operations and abilities. And unlike the positivists, the rationalists believed that there were aspects of reality that could not be arrived at simply through sensations, that we had to use logical deduction, analysis, argument, dialectic, thinking, rationalism, thinking, in order to arrive at certain conclusions. To the equation, the rationalists added issues of morality and intention and motivation. This argument put forth that when we think about something, there's motivation behind the thinking. There's emotional and moral constructs in the thinking itself. It's not just merely a processing of data. We can make a further distinction between empiricists and rationalists through induction and deduction. Empiricists use induction. It's the acquisition of knowledge through specific sensory input that is then generalized into a bigger picture, a theory, perhaps. But in deduction, for rationalists, deduction is the idea that the framework itself dictates certain conclusions must follow from the sensory information. Induction is a little bit more of collecting samples and then looking at those samples taken as a whole, whereas deduction is starting with a theoretical framework, starting at a point of view and understanding that that point of view itself is shaping what you're seeing, the pieces of information, how they're fitting together before you even encounter them. Of course, this is a rather clean and neat distinction we're making here, and in truth, some empiricists were more interested in an active mind than others, and some rationalists were a bit more interested in sensory data than others. But typically, we can understand the distinction between top-down and bottom-up processing. The empiricists were really bottom-up thinkers, from the senses to the brain, and the rationalists were more top-down thinkers. From the brain, knowledge is derived. So over the course of this week, we're going to be looking in episode 6 at a handful of thinkers of rationalism. We're going to start with Baruch Spinoza. We'll then turn to Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz. We then look at Immanuel Kant, and finally, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Baruch Spinoza was born to Jewish parents, Portuguese Jewish parents, and he lived in Amsterdam in Holland. He was born in 1632 and died in 1677. Now, at the time, Holland was the intellectual capital of Europe. People like Locke and Descartes were living in and around Amsterdam. Now, Spinoza began as a strong adherent to the philosophy of René Descartes. He even wrote his first text on Descartes. But eventually he went his own way. He developed his own ideas, and he argued against Descartes' dualism, and instead he proposed that God, matter, and mind were one. And in this way, we refer to him as a monist. We view Spinoza as God is one reality, and that one reality, that inseparable reality, is God, matter, and mind, or God, matter, and consciousness, if we could think of it this way. Now, this idea of this monist idea was so offensive to both the Christian and the Jewish traditions that the clergy actually convinced the officials, the civil authorities of Holland, to banish Spinoza from the city, and he in fact was excommunicated from his faith and from the Jewish faith, and he was asked to leave the city. He did return eventually, and he made his living teaching Cartesian philosophy and as a lens grinder, a glassmaker. He even was offered a position at the University of Heidelberg, but in order to accept an academic position at this time, he would have to renounce his criticisms of Christianity, which he refused to do. So he supported himself as an eyeglass lens maker. Now, Spinoza's most famous book is The Ethics. And this is the text that when we study Spinoza, we mostly focus on. And it was published after his death in 1677. Now, Spinoza used a deductive method, and he actually proposed a set of axioms that, if one followed, would help them to answer questions in an ethically correct and personally satisfying way. And that was really the point of his book on ethics, or how to act. Spinoza's belief system was one of pantheism, that God exists in everything. And this idea of a spirit of God existing in everything exists in his philosophy as well. This is really a deconstruction of the sacred and the secular. There were no demons or angels. There was only nature, and God expressed through nature. So technically, Spinoza's view of the human being, the idea that mind and body were two aspects of the same thing, is technically a form of dualism called double aspectism. But this double aspectism, this idea that the mind influences the body influences his mind, was so unified that some do consider Spinoza to be less of a dualist and more of a monist. In fact, Spinoza described the mind and body as two sides of a coin. So anything happening to the body creates emotions and thoughts, and emotions and thoughts result in reactions in the body. This theory has been called this psychophysical double aspectism. It's also been called double aspect monism, and it can also just simply be called double aspectism. Everything for Spinoza is thinking, physical substance. Everything is God. Everything is a thinking material substance. That means everything has a consciousness. This pantheism, or this idea that God exists in everything, also brings up the term of panpsychism. And panpsychism is the idea that because God is everywhere, thus mind is everywhere. Everything holds consciousness. Another interesting aspect of Spinoza is his denial of free will. Spinoza reasoned that God is nature and nature is lawful. Humans are part of nature, and therefore humans are lawful. And that we may have the experience of choosing, but in fact we're agents of a lawful, God-ordered process. Listen to Spinoza in his own words. In the mind there is no absolute or free will, but the mind is determined to wish this or that by a cause, which has also been determined by another cause, and this last by another cause, and so on in infinity. So he's describing what feels like free will, but is actually not a choice, but the result of many layers of cause and effect reactions. He said, men think themselves free inasmuch as they are conscious of their volitions and desires, and never even dream in their ignorance of the causes which we have disposed them so to wish and desire. So for Spinoza, freedom means knowing that everything that happens must happen, and it's necessary that it happens, that this is just the way it should be. And that acceptance, Spinoza says, is freedom. For Spinoza, it makes no sense to believe in God and free will. It's one or the other. So Spinoza didn't believe in a judgmental God, one that made judgment on our decisions because there was no free will. But what he did feel was important was that we studied and understood the cause of things, and in this way we'd understand God. Spinoza said, "The free man is one conscious of the necessities that compel him." So for Spinoza, it's not, freedom isn't doing what one wants. Freedom is knowing why one does what one does. Concerning emotions and motivations, Spinoza felt that everything we call good or evil really reduces down to pleasure and pain. But how Spinoza defined pleasure and pain might be a little different than how we would commonly think of it. For Spinoza's, pain meant the entertaining of clear ideas or having a clear purpose. That's knowing what one's after, being very clear. This is pleasure. A clear idea is one that is conducive to the mind's survival because it understands and reflects on causality. And pain or bad refers to a mind that is overwhelmed and overcome by passion, feels weak and vulnerable and confused. This might be understood as the individual who may be dealing with some addictive activity and might have a sense of not being able to stop, can't help oneself. This would be painful. This would be overruled by passions or emotions. Spinoza asked us to look for a big picture perspective. If we were getting caught up in the momentary passions, this was painful, this was not clear thinking. We needed the bigger picture. We needed God's view. He also went as far as to say that the senses present a muddled, an unclear view, and it's the mind that makes things clear. This is why we call him a rationalist. Clear ideas come from thoughtfulness, from thinking, from considering, from working through in the mind. Listen what Spinoza felt the good life was. The good life consists of that which is most useful, favorable to our nature. The bad life is that which is most opposed to it. Vice and wickedness are to be avoided, and not because they are punished by God, who engages in no such absurd endeavors, but because they are at variance with our nature and lead us to despair. This was a theology that wasn't based on judgment, but rather on being true to one's nature, being true to nature that one is in. Spinoza had an interesting distinction between emotions and passions. For Spinoza, emotion was something that was linked to a thought, but a passion was not linked to a thought. Love is an emotion, but emotional upheaval is passion. And passion leads to a non-adaptive behavior, something that doesn't aid in survival, so it should be avoided. Today, we might consider passion to be something like rage. We might consider similarities between Freudian psychoanalysis and Spinoza's philosophy. Freud felt that knowing oneself, that examining the unconscious motivations, knowing why one does what one does, the causes, leads to clearer thinking, leads to better adaptability. This is very much similar to Spinoza's worldview. Some theorists and historians of philosophy actually consider Spinoza to be the greatest pre-Freudian psychoanalyst. Spinoza identified about 48 different emotions that manifested from the basic emotions and situations that we encounter in life. The kind of psychology Spinoza did was, he said if something was loved and then hated, it would turn out to be more hated if it was first loved than had it just been hated from the beginning. He also said that we don't only love and hate things that cause us pleasure or pain, but we love and hate things that resemble the things that cause us pleasure and pain. When we think of things that cause pleasure and pain, we also conjure up ambivalent, mixed emotions of love and hate. even went as far as saying that we could project painful experiences from the past onto present situations. And that indeed is a very psychoanalytic concept. Perhaps one of the most interesting commentaries he made on the psychology of human beings is that if there's something that we love and someone is disparaging to it, someone creates pleasure in something we hate, or pain in something that we have pleasure in, we end up hating that person who takes on that position in favor of the thing that we have strong feelings for. Some of the other emotions that Spinoza wrote on include emotions of wonder, contempt, love, hatred, devotion, hope, fear, confidence, joy, disappointment, despair, repentance, indignation, jealousy, sympathy, envy, pride, honor, shame, regret, gratitude, revenge, cowardice, ambition, and lust. In part 2 of episode 6, we'll be looking at Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz. That's on the Dr. Joby podcast. Thanks for listening. Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is part 2 of episode 6 on rationalism in the 18th century. Today we're going to be taking a look at Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, Immanuel Kant, and George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. We're continuing our exploration of rationalism, the reaction against empiricism of the 18th century. Leibniz was born in 1646 and he died in 1716, which is the early 18th century. He was born in Leipzig, Germany. And although he's lesser known than Newton, he independently and simultaneously developed calculus. Leibniz was a bit of a genius, a child prodigy. His father was a professor at the University of Leipzig, and Leibniz entered the university at 15. He finished his doctorate by the age of 20. In 1704, Leibniz wrote new essays on the understanding, which was a polemic against Locke's empiricism. But the book wasn't published until 50 years later. It turned out that Locke passed away in 1704, just when the book was being completed, and Leibniz didn't see the point in publishing a polemic against a dead philosopher. It turns out that in Leibniz's reading of Locke, he felt that Locke had described a mind that once void of any sensory data was empty, a tabula rasa. Of course, Locke in his writings did describe some innate processes, but for Leibniz, Locke was a pure tabula rasa philosopher. In other words, the mind really was a blank slate with nothing written upon it before sensory data. Now, Leibniz's take on Locke and his adaptation of Locke's empiricism went something like this: there's nothing in this mind that is not first in the senses except the mind itself. So we see here that the mind becomes the slate is in itself something that shapes what the senses understand, or how the senses are represented. So this for Leibniz is very important. The mind itself is a shaping container, something that adds to knowledge itself. Then Leibniz really took it to the end of the argument and said that experience has nothing to do with ideas whatsoever. Leibniz's idea here is that the idea is in the mind and that the senses activate the idea. Listen to his metaphor of the marble statue. Reflection is nothing but attention to what is within us. And the senses do not give us what we carry with us already. I have used the analogy of a veined block of marble as I oppose to an entirely homogeneous block of marble, or to a blank tablet, what the philosophers called a tabula rasa. For if the soul were like such a blank tablet, then truths would be in us as the shape of Hercules is in the piece of marble, when the marble is entirely neutral as to whether it assumes this shape or some other. However, if there were veins in the block which marked out the shape of Hercules rather than other shapes, then that block would be more determined to the shape, and Hercules would be innate in it. In a way, even though labor would be required to expose the veins and to polish them into clarity, removing everything that prevents their being seen. This is how ideas and truths are innate in us, as inclinations, dispositions, tendencies, or natural potentialities. We see here is Leibniz's claim that the mind actually gives shape to the experiences we have. Our experiences are something that reflect the structure of our mind. Leibniz developed a rather fascinating version of monadology. He was a monist. He believed that everything was of the same substance. There were no body and mind split. There was no physical and metaphysical. Everything was a monadology. And he claimed that life was everywhere. Everything was living. For Leibniz, everything was composed of an infinite number of life units. And these life units were called monads. And all monads had consciousness. Leibniz proposed that there was a hierarchy of these monads. And at the one end of the hierarchy, there was a muddled thinking, and this was inert matter. And the inert matter had thought, but it was a very muddled thought. Then would come plants, microbes, insects, animals, humans, and finally God. And at the highest end was the clearest of all consciousness, humans just below God. So, therefore, there's a quantitative difference between all living things, and all things were living. Leibniz proposed that each thing was living and that it each had a final cause, something it was striving towards. The reason humans' thinking was not always clear was because we share some of the matter that are shared with plants and animals, and that muddles our thinking. So everything is alive, and everything has some degree of conscious thought, and higher order living things, higher order things are clearer in thinking than lower order things. And we're all living towards some final goal, some potential that we have within us. Now, Leibniz felt that everything was created perfectly in perfect harmony by God. And he also proposed that nothing affects other things. Each living monad can perceive things going on and has a mirror of its external world, but never has a real view of the external world. So this means that monads mirror what is external to them, but never affect what is external to them. Leibniz described two identical perfect clocks that have been set to the same time at the same moment. Afterward, the clocks will always be in agreement, but will not interact. And according to Leibniz, all monads, including those constituting the mind and the body, are like these two clocks. These two clocks were set by God. So we have a perception in time, and we have reality, and the two do not interact with each other, but are mirroring one another. It's interesting to note that Voltaire would criticize Leibniz in Candide as being an old foolish professor who claims that this is the best of all possible worlds, despite all of the tragedies that exist. Leibniz proposed something called the law of continuity, which would be our experience of our conscious experience of the world. He said that our conscious experience is actually an unconscious process. And in this law of continuity, Leibniz claims that there's no leaps in nature. Everything is always a gradual process. Listen to his analogy here of the roaring of the sea perception. To give a clearer idea of these minute perceptions which we are unable to pick out from the crowd, I like to use the example of the roaring noise of the sea, which impresses itself on us when we are standing on the shore. To hear this noise as we do, we must hear the parts which make up this whole, that is, the noise of each wave, although each of these little noises makes itself known only when combined confusedly with all the others, and would not be noticed if the wave which made it were by itself. We must be affected slightly by the motion of this wave, and have some perception of each of the noises, however faint they may be. Otherwise, there would be no perception of 100,000 waves, since 100,000 nothings cannot make something. Moreover, we never sleep so soundly that we do not have some feeble and confused sensation, some perception of its start, which is small, just as the strongest force of the world would never break a rope unless the least force strained and stretched it slightly, even though that little lengthening which is produced is imperceptible. So these individual molecules of waves would be the structure of the unconscious. Leibniz called perceptions that occurred below the level of awareness petite perceptions, little perceptions. These petite perceptions combine into a force that eventually becomes conscious awareness, or what we call apperception. So for Leibniz, apperception is conscious awareness, built or comprised of small, petite perceptions. This might be the first postulate of an unconscious mind. Leibniz is also the first person to introduce the concept of liminality, or limen, as in subliminal. Limen is a threshold of awareness of conscious experience. Reaction to Leibniz is varied. On one hand, certainly on a very empirical or experimental side of things, historians and thinkers dismiss Leibniz as one person called him a 17th century Parmenides, someone who used very strange ideas and obfuscated words to make the metaphysical sound more scientific. Others felt that he was the beginning of German philosophy, the most brilliant of German philosophers. The work of Leibniz was so brilliant and so full of inspiration that it has often seemed to be the spontaneous birth of German philosophy, said one historian. One of Leibniz's students, Christian von Wolff, was the first to use the term psychology in a book called Empirical Psychology from 1732. So we see here a very controversial figure, and it's probably a matter of ideology whether you embrace or reject Leibniz. Let's pause and consider the grand intellectual history, a bird's eye view. Somewhere between 700 and 600 BCE, in the West and Greek culture, the answers to the big questions started to come from reason and thinking, rather than through stories and myth. We call this the philosophical split from mythology. It was then practiced as simultaneously with mythology and religion, philosophy, and it was in the 1600s, 1700s, that something occurred in philosophy that has come to be known as the Kantian split. And that would have been in the 1700s. Kant was born in 1724 and died in 1804. And right at this split, maybe we can even mark the beginning of the 19th century with this, philosophy veered in two directions. The one direction, philosophy adhered to the ideas that logic and mathematics and reason would lead to big T truths. Philosophy would provide these answers through mathematics and logic. And the other side of philosophy was skeptical. This other group of philosophers was skeptical of big T truths. They were interested in how truth functions, what truth means, and how truth can be little T truth within a system of knowledge. These philosophers were less interested in mathematical models and maybe even less interested in logic and more interested in life philosophy, in emotions and drives, and even telling, discussing and telling the stories of the human tradition through narratives, through novels. These were folks who largely were rejecting academic philosophy and doing philosophy in the cafes. This split, this Kantian split, both of them harken back to Kant. Both the analytic philosophers, these are the individuals who believed in the big T truths, the logic and mathematical models, and the continental philosophers, those who were more interested in the phenomenon of living. These both find common soil with Kant. Immanuel Kant really was an event in the history of philosophy, in intellectual history. So what was it about Kant? What was it that Kant said, did, thought that caused a divide in philosophy? And what was his main ideas? Kant was born into a poor family in Königsberg in Prussia, 1724. And he was a very regular individual. As a matter of fact, he never traveled more than 40 miles from his birthplace in his entire 80 years of life. He made his living teaching at the University of Königsberg till he was 73. And then he resigned because there was pressure put on him to stop expressing his religious views in his lectures. Kant became so popular as a lecturer that students came from all over Europe to hear him speak. He became a bit of a celebrity, and his two famous books were The Critique of Pure Reason, written in 1781, and The Critique of Practical Reason, written in 1788. Most agree that Kant is the person who laid the groundwork for all of what contemporary philosophy is. So what was so remarkable about Kant? What made him differ from the empiricists, and what did he offer that was new? Well, Kant had been very much a disciple of Leibniz. He was an adherent to Leibniz's thought, and he read Hume's philosophy, and he claims that when he read David Hume's works, he'd become awakened from his dogmatic slumbers, meaning he had an aha moment, something clicked in his head. And this is what clicked for Kant. Kant felt that it wasn't merely sensations that comprised knowledge, and that the mind, the brain, was not only an area where ideas associated, but that the mind itself, the shape of the mind, or the structure of the mind itself, put meaning into the stimulus and the sensory information that we encountered, what we'd call input. So let's look at this firstly unpacked through an analogy with some contemporary technology. If you have input that you put into a computer, information you place into a computer, the information becomes meaningful based on what program you're running that information in. Different programs will make the information look different. Some programs perhaps will not even run the information that you input into it. So the idea here is that you have input, sensory data input, and that sensory data input does not become meaningful, does not take on meaning or significance or display on a monitor or on a broadcast through speakers or printer output. It doesn't take on meaning until it is processed in a certain program. Now, for Kant, the analogy here is the brain, the mind, has a program that it runs on. And the input that you put into this program, the information that comes through the senses, is processed by the program, and the program itself contributes to the meaning making and structure of what the output is, what the reality is. So Kant said that the brain, in its pre-programmed way, puts information in different categories. So input that we encounter through the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, and the skin enters into the sensory apparatus and then into the mind, and the mind has pre-established categories. The structure of the mind has pre-established categories, and these categories infuse meaning into the sensory experience. Some of the categories that Kant said we come into the world pre-wired with. The brain is set up to experience in this way. Some of these categories of thought are the idea of unity, of totality, of time and space. These are, of cause and effect, these are categories that the brain the mind is set up to experience. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's reality outside of the brain, but it means that anything we come into contact will be filtered through these concepts of space and time, cause and effect, totality, unity, the idea of reality itself, quantity and quality, negation, possibility, impossibility, existence and non-existence. These are basic structures of meaning that are in the brain. Imagine that when you pour liquid into a container, the liquid takes on the shape of the container. Well, for Kant, this is the idea of sensory data coming into the mind. Anything that's out there in the physical world or in what we think the thing in itself takes on meaning within the phenomenal world, the world inside of our minds. In fact, it's the world that our minds create. Now, this was a very radical idea, the idea that the mind is really actively creating reality. This has been a monumental impact on philosophy and how we think about reality, especially today in virtual reality. And perhaps you can see the similarities with contemporary cognitive thought. Kant distinguished between the thing in itself and the phenomenal world. The thing of itself would be the pre-input version of whatever it is we experience, the stuff that's out there. We never come into contact with this consciously. What we come into conscious contact with is the phenomenal world. I like to think of phenomenal world or phenomenology in this way. We can be in a room and feel warm or cold. That's the phenomenal experience. When we go to a thermostat or a temperature gauge and look and read what the temperature is quantifiably, and we see that it's 65 degrees, we can then defer to that and privilege the numbered measurement over our physiological experience, our phenomenal experience. And some of us will submit and say, well, there must be something wrong with me because it's not cold in here. I'm cold. And this is a worldview. There's an alternative worldview. There's another worldview, and that is not regarding the quantitative measurement and giving more credence or more importance to the subjective experience of being cold. After all, if you're cold regardless of what the temperature says it is. Now, of course, philosophers will go on to debate and to explore the connection between the quantitative world and the phenomenological world. An example of this might be expressed in the ancient Greek conception of time. The Greeks discussed two different types of time, kairos time and chronos time. Chronos time is a time that's measured by angles of the sun, or maybe today by a clock. That's chronological or chronos time. What time is it? Kairos time is a different kind of time. Kairos time is the time that happens in the independent from the clock. It's Kairos time. It's the right time. It's the time when one feels that it's the moment to act. Maybe it's the right time. Things happen as they should or when they will. This is Kairos time. And it seems to me that this is a phenomenological time. This is a real distinction between the quantitative empirical world and the phenomenological world, and even down to maybe we're tempted to call it the subjective world. But the moment we call it the subjective world, we're speaking from the point of view of empiricism. Because in phenomenology, in the phenomenological world, there's no subject-object split. There's not me and the thing. There's just me participating in meaning-making with whatever is there. The separation in meaning is not there. In order to speak of something as subjective or objective, one must accept a subject-object split, that I'm not participating in the object itself. So this is a very, very serious occurrence in philosophy that opens up a lot of questions and causes a great divide, perhaps is the cause of the great divide in philosophy. Kant felt that not only was the perception of time something that was a psychological phenomenon, but also the perception of space. Our belief that when we walk into a room and walk down the street, that we're actually moving through space is a phenomenological experience. In modern terms or contemporary terms, we can understand that visual stimulus is activating the two-dimensional sheet of retinal tissue, and that whatever we are perceiving, or I should say detecting in the environment, is activated on a flat two-dimensional sheet of neural tissue that sends impulses into the brain, and the entire experience is converted or transduced into the phenomenon of space and time in the mind. But what we actually have contact with comes through a two-dimensional flat sheet of neural tissue, not unlike a painter's canvas or a sheet of paper where we draw, seeing larger as closer and smaller as farther away. Juxtaposing these images, like in a flip book, we experience time. Time is movement. We can't conclude our conversation about Immanuel Kant without discussing the categorical imperative. This is Kant's contribution, or one of his contributions, to ethics and morality. How should we act? Now, for Kant, the categorical imperative goes something like this: I should never act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become universal law. What Kant is saying here is, whenever we come to a decision on how to act, a choice to make, we should ask ourselves, if everyone acted in this way, if this was the way that everyone chose to solve this problem of action, would it be a good thing or a bad thing? Would it be beneficial or not beneficial to humankind? And this is the categorical imperative, to take a larger view of one's actions on a bigger scale. In part 3 of episode 6, we'll be concluding rationalism with looking at another powerhouse in German philosophy, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Thanks for listening to the podcast. See you next time. Hi, welcome to part 3 of episode 6, Rationalism in the History of Psychology. This is dealing with the 18th and 19th centuries in rationalism. Today we're going to take a look at Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, one of the most influential German philosophers of the 19th century. That's today on the Dr. Joby podcast. Hegel was born in 1770 in Stuttgart, Germany. He died in 1831. As a young man, he made a thorough study of the different historical, religious ideas on the meaning of life, including the historical Christian thoughts on the meaning of life. He supported himself throughout his life through an inheritance from his family and also as a part-time lecturer in university. He also fathered a son with his landlady and adopted this son as to when he married someone half his age, a girl of a prominent family in the area. They went on to have 2 of their own sons, and he raised the 3 sons together. In 1818, Hegel accepted one of the most prestigious academic positions in Europe. He became chair of the philosophy department at the University of Berlin, and he remained in Berlin until he died in 1831 of cholera. He was the young age of 61. Now, Hegel introduced the idea of something called the absolute. For Hegel, the absolute was the big picture. And he said looking at things in particular isolated instances, looking at the elements of things was really meaningless unless they were placed within the context of the big picture. This big picture is referred to in Hegelian philosophy as the absolute. So everything takes on meaning depending on its context. Individual things within themselves are meaningless. It's the absolute, the context that determines meaning. Hegel went on to say that there were no truths except the truth of the whole. This is another way of looking at structures of knowledge. Hegel proposed a way of seeking knowledge, and it went something like this, that first we had to determine what concepts the senses exemplified. When we saw something, when we heard something, touched something, smelled something, when we came into contact with it, we had to determine what it exemplified, what it was an example of. Once we've identified the concepts, the feel of the concepts that it was bringing about, we would have to think about rationally how these concepts related with one another in a larger structure, in a larger picture, to understand meaning of the experience. And finally, when one sees the interrelatedness of all the aspects, of all the concepts, then one experiences the absolute, the big picture. So this is really a big picture kind of thinking. And it is abstract. We're here not talking particularly about senses or elements of experience. We're talking about the experience of phenomenon. For Hegel, this big picture, this absolute, was like philosophy as a speculative theology. It was really understanding the big picture as God. So Hegel was not so inclined to believe in miracles and certain church dogma that were mystical, but he did take church teachings very seriously. He wrote 2 books, The Life of Jesus and also The Spirit of Christianity. But he really had a sympathy and an influence from Christian theology, but his theory itself was not necessarily a spiritual or a religious or even a Christian theology. It was just very influenced by the teachings, these theological teachings on a more absolute level. Hegel was definitely interested in the whole rather than the parts. For Hegel, the whole was greater than the parts. not unlike we will find later in the manifestation of Gestalt psychology. This is how Bertrand Russell summarized Hegel's philosophy. Hegel conceives the ethical relation of the citizen to the state as analogous to that of the eye to the body. In his place, the citizen is part of a valuable whole, but isolated, he is as useless as an isolated eye. Now, Hegel claimed that the way we get to this absolute knowledge is through something called the dialectic, or the dialectical process. And this simply means that it's a pattern that we see repeating in history. And Hegel simply labeled the pattern that we can see. So, for instance, here's an example. If, say, Heraclitus in the pre-Socratic Heraclitus said that everything was constantly changing, Parmenides said the exact opposite, that everything was never changing. And then out of these two dialectical or opposing dialectical positions, these dichotomous positions, Plato said some things change and some things did not. Plato's view was a synthesis of Heraclitus's view and Parmenides' view. So we call the first view that we discussed the thesis. Hegel called the opposing view, the negated view, the negation of that view, the antithesis, the opposite point of view. So we have a thesis and its opposite, the antithesis. And then what comes out of that is the synthesis. It's a view that in some way is born out of the thesis and the antithesis. The cycle continues and the new synthesis becomes the thesis, and then there's an antithesis. And this just goes on and works towards the absolute. We can speak of a first negation, and then we typically think of a second negation. So Hegel felt that after the second negation, we were at the absolute. He also, working off of Kant's base, proposed that there were a few more categories of thought, a few more structures of the mind that shaped knowledge. So Hegel was very interested in supporting Kant's ideas of categories. The categories, according to Hegel, exist to move knowledge closer to the absolute. Now, in psychology, the most important work is the phenomenology of spirit, or the phenomenology of mind. This book carries two different titles depending on the translation that you purchase. The German term Geiste, or Geist, is a very ambiguous term. It encompasses what we call of a psychological sense or a spirit or a feel, or it's a spirit like a Zeitgeist, the spirit of the times is another term that Hegel will use. So this term in itself is rather abstract and really touches on the feel of Hegel's philosophy itself. In fact, we've used this term of Hegel's in the history of psychology. As a matter of fact, the term Zeitgeist is prominent in historical studies. And we also look at Hegel, we consider Hegel to be the first real philosopher of history. He is also an individual who was greatly influential on Karl Marx. As a matter of fact, where Marx wrote of the physical dialectic, the material dialectic, this is built on Hegel's idea of a spirit dialectic, a Zeitgeist dialectic. Hegel also looked into the issue of alienation or self-estrangement. This is the idea that an individual feels disconnected from the absolute. Marx adopted this term alienation to describe the separation from government and the fruits of labor and the individual and what one produces, this alienation. Hegel has influenced everyone from Carl Rogers to Erich Fromm to Karl Marx. He's one of the most influential philosophers in the 19th century. And as we go forth in the 19th century, and 20th century, certainly looking next into Romanticism and existentialism, we'll see that many of these romantic and existential philosophers were building on Hegel's thinking. So in episode 7, we'll be turning to existentialism and Romanticism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Thanks for listening to the Dr. Joby podcast.